Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive podcast. I am your host, Austin Render, episode 32 of our podcast as we continue to roll into the new year. This is our first episode of the new year. So I guess even though Larry David says, I think January 3rd is the last time you can wish somebody a happy new year. Happy New Year to our Dribble Drive listeners. And we have a very special episode today because we have a fun announcement that joining us now as a co-host of the Dribble Drive is Dalton Shetler. You've heard him on the podcast. You might have seen him if you've watched us on the YouTube stream. He's going to join us now going forward. Dalton, welcome to the show, I guess, officially now a co-host of the Dribble Drive. Thanks for doing this, man.
Are you kidding me? Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm so excited. I mean, you and I, Austin, we text and we talk a lot about Big Ten women's basketball. So to have a platform where we can talk a lot about this, I was fired up when you texted me. I'm really excited to get this going.
Yeah, people are going to have to prepare for the longer episodes as we go on tangents about women's basketball here. But no, we're excited. If you're listening to us on podcast, we appreciate you. Give us a like, a download, a subscribe. A rating, all that stuff helps us on Apple and Spotify podcast. You can also find us on YouTube. We're on the Back Home Network YouTube channel brought to you by Home Field Apparel. So make sure you check us out in video form there. We have a lot of graphics and visual aids we like to use during the show. So if you want to see that stuff, we're live every Tuesday at noon. And then you can always go back and watch us after the fact as well. Dalton, a lot of stuff to talk about in Big Ten women's basketball this week. Let's start with the new top 25 from yesterday. We've got UCLA and USC and Maryland all staying put in their respective positions. No huge surprise there. Michigan State moves up, or Ohio State moves up one. Michigan State moves up one. Iowa stays put, not punished for the loss to Maryland. And then Michigan drops one after they lost to the number one team in the country a week ago on New Year's. But I don't think any surprises there. I think the two names in the receiving votes are two teams we're going to talk a little bit about today because those two teams are playing some really good basketball right now. Minnesota only one loss this season. That was at Nebraska. Washington 2-1. In the Big Ten with a couple of wins over Illinois and Northwestern last week. I was impressed by Washington watching them on New Year's Eve, and we can talk about them in that game. But and we're going to talk about them actually. Gary Hill's going to. We recorded a podcast or an interview with him earlier because they play today. They're at home against Wisconsin, so we'll have that interview for you coming up. But anything from this that stands out to you, Dalton? Your Spartans move up one spot, beat Purdue last week. You've had a week off, correct?
Yeah, no, this is and I was taking a look at the schedule. This seems to be the only real breath we take. So we've taken it now, and now it'll be interesting to see how it continues forward for Michigan State. And by the way, apologies to the listeners for the cold. We're all kind of fighting some things here. But to your point about the top 25, no, I think it was all pretty standard based on everything we saw from the past week. You're right about Washington. I'm really fired up to hear that interview a little bit later on with Gary Hill Jr. because Washington this past week, all of a sudden, it kind of went from, oh, you're seeing them compete at a pretty decent level in a pretty tough Big Ten conference to where they're knocking off Illinois and whatnot. And you're saying, okay, what is this team? What is the potential of this team? And we're still trying to figure out a lot of different squads at this point, right? A lot of teams are 4 Big Ten games in, so on and so forth. For Michigan State, they had the win against Purdue. Not much else in there this past week. I was really excited to see that Iowa didn't move much and wasn't really punished for the loss against Maryland. I'm curious how it would have went if the score would have stayed a 25 point differential where Maryland was in front of Iowa. But Iowa showed a lot of grit coming back in that game to make it close there at the end and give themselves a shot. So not much surprises me. I find it interesting, and I don't disagree with the poll. With Maryland ahead of Ohio State as it's been recently. Both those teams, you're kind of still waiting to see some challengers. Maryland, you got to see them take on a Michigan State team. They were up 17. Michigan State tied it with a couple of minutes left. Maryland then prevailed and got the win by 6. You saw them beat Duke already. You've seen them beat Iowa. Ohio State, you're really kind of waiting to see a top-level team kind of take on the Buckeyes. That way we kind of know what Ohio State's all about. We know the talent's there, but kind of excited to see one of those challengers.
We'll get that tomorrow, and we'll talk about it later in the show. They play on the road at Michigan, so a good test. Remember, that was their only loss for the majority of the Big Ten
Yeah.
season last year, was
Yeah.
their loss. I believe that was a December Big Ten game.
Mhm.
Lost to Michigan and then just ran the table the rest of the way until they lost the game at the end. It didn't matter at Iowa. So that'll be a fun one tomorrow. But you bring up that Maryland-Iowa game. That's my game of the week. The Terps have you mentioned the Michigan State game, and I didn't think about this until now. That's 2 straight where Maryland has opened up big leads on top 20, 25 teams and then started to let them back into it. Iowa cut this to a 5-point game with about 4.5 minutes left, and they couldn't quite get over the hump there. It's hard. You get 25 down, you have that like little door open where you have to get through it at that exact moment. And when you don't, Kayleen Smeichel is going to hit some 3-pointers on you. And that's exactly what she did. You got to look at this Maryland team. I won't see them until February in person, but Kayleen Smeichel is really taking her game to another level. And I think in another year where there aren't superpowers, there's always going to be superpowers in this league, but you're going to have Juju, you're going to have Lauren Betts probably battling for player of the year, but Kayleen Smeichel is a first-team All-Big Ten performer, and she really showed out at Iowa City.
I think you're right. And what I noticed from looking at this Maryland squad, look, last year was a bit of an anomaly under Brenda Freeze, right? That team came short of expectations and kind of the standard they have at Maryland, which is a very high standard, to be fair. I mean, we're talking about one of the best blue blood programs that exists, especially within the Big Ten Conference. But what they have this year, and I think it's a little bit different maybe from the typical Brenda Freeze team, it's the depth. I mean, they can go into their bench where normally I feel like Brenda Freeze kind of throws out some talented players. They play, they win, but now there's some depth added on to the typical Brenda Freeze squad. And when you look at Cheyenne Sellers, of course, still being there, it was one of those moments where you look at a college athlete and you're like, you're still here, huh? Like you still have eligibility. Cheyenne Sellers still being there. I mean, she's been so good for Maryland. Honestly, she's really the reason they made the NCAA tournament last year. Well, with all of her play individually, she's still doing her thing. But then you pair it with Kayleen Smeichel, who's their leading scorer. I like the addition they got in Saylor Poffenbarger, able to step outside, the versatility. They've got some stuff inside like this. This is an all-around team where it's just piece by piece by piece. It just fits. McDaniel's still there, coming off the bench. It feels almost like a more comfortable role for her to come in and hit some shots and play some defense. It really fits together really well. And I know we took a look when the offseason started and the transfer portal opened up and Brenda Freeze started grabbing piece by piece by piece. And you're like, wow, that looks like a lot of talent. I'm sure it's a great thing. I wonder how it all fits together, and it really works there in College Park. Brenda's really got this recipe down. It's a talented but also well-rounded squad.
I think Tabiasu's helped a lot too at the point guard position. They were really missing a big and a ball handler last year, and that showed. And I think it's a great point. Bree McDaniel, a double-digit scorer, is now coming off the bench. And she provides a really good spark for this team. It's their third top 25 win of the season. You mentioned them, Duke, Michigan State, and Iowa now. 14-0 is their best start since 2011, 2012. And they're getting just production all over. Smeichel, Sellers, McDaniel, Ali Kubak. You mentioned Poffenbarger, Tabiasu. I mean, this is a team that can hit you in so many ways. How about this line for Kayleen Smeichel? 26 points, 5 rebounds, 6 steals, 4 of 5 from the 3-point line, including some daggers late in that game. When Iowa had cut it to 11, she hit had cut it to 5. She hit 2 3-pointers to get it back to 11. So Maryland is undefeated still in conference play with that win. They beat Rutgers earlier in the week as well. 14-0, 4-0 with the Big Ten. Another team undefeated is my team of the week, which is the number 1 ranked UCLA Bruins. A top 25 win at home against Michigan, who really pushed them. And we could talk about the many accolades that I got from this game. I mean, first, Silas Swords. Goodness, 30 points at the number 1 team in the country. She did everything she could to keep this team in that game. And she fought hard. And that's, I give UCLA a lot of credit. Every time Michigan cut this game to 7, 8, 9 points, they'd make a little run, and then UCLA would go on a 6-7-0 run, and boom, it's back to 15, 16 points. They ultimately win the game 86-70. That's another top 25 win for UCLA, who has not earned this number one ranking just by being undefeated and playing nobody. I mean, they've beaten South Carolina, they've beaten Louisville, they've beaten Creighton, they've now beaten Washington and Indiana on the road. They beat Michigan at home, they beat Nebraska at home. And they earned it. And I got my first look at them this weekend when they beat Indiana 73-62. Lauren Betts is, and I know that Kim Adams was bringing this up on the Fox broadcast, she should absolutely be in the conversation for National Player of the Year. I mean, she is an absolute stud, put up 25 and 12 in Bloomington. And what doesn't, you can't look at the score sheet when you talk about Lauren Betts. To me, you just watch a game and you see, oh my gosh, every play that Indiana tries to run, she's impacting in some way, because whether it's a tipped pass, she comes out to the free throw line and blocks a shot, or she doesn't allow you to drive when you normally would because you're scared of her blocking your shot. She may only have one steal, one block, but she impacts 20, 25 possessions defensively just with her length and her presence in the middle of the paint. I was so impressed by her. Kiki Rice did not have a good game in Bloomington. Honestly, UCLA probably didn't have more than their B-minus game. And they still just, I describe these types of games as just a 40-minute stiff arm. Indiana had a bad second quarter. They scored just 5 points. They went 8 minutes without a basket. And once UCLA established that double-digit lead, it was just a stiff arm the entire way. It never got inside 8 points. And Indiana, to their credit, never went away. But UCLA just did not let them get a sniff of it. And the crowd was ready to make this thing crazy. And Indiana just couldn't quite get over the hump. I'm so impressed with UCLA. I'm really excited to see them play the likes of USC and Maryland and Ohio State. I'm ready for these teams to start playing each other, because it is really good basketball that Corey Close has them playing.
Oh, no, and I think it's a great point. And also, I mean, it's what you come to expect, right, from a number one team to go on the road in a hostile environment and handle business. And I mean, to your point, they were able to do that even though they didn't play their best basketball. And you got the graphic there at the bottom for the audio audience that Lauren Betts, player of the week, 2 double-doubles, the work she did against Indiana. I think the talent they have, and when you mentioned that class, that tier in the Big Ten of USC, Maryland, Ohio State, once we get to see those teams go against each other, that's where I think a lot of chaos starts to ensue and a lot of fun starts to kind of ripple away from there. And we're going to actually have one of those coming up later this week, not to jump ahead to one of the future
We're all
segments of the
excited
show.
for it.
I know, but you start getting these games. And besides that, we have a couple of other pretty big games this week that we'll be talking about too. But I think it's really fascinating with UCLA in the first year in the Big Ten Conference for them to dominate and kind of make their stamp the way they have alongside USC. And it's not unexpected. I mean, we talked about this before the season. We kind of expected this, but it's still another thing to actually go out and do it. And so far, UCLA has been able to do that alongside USC for that matter. And by the way, I did want to mention, you mentioned Silas Swords for Freshman of the Week, 30 points in that game at UCLA. I mean, and we've seen her really test a lot of, she announced herself in the first game of the season when they played against South Carolina, had a dominant game as a freshman against South Carolina and Dawn Staley. It really was a pretty awe-striking, maybe for a lack of a better term. But so far, she's been able to keep that up. And really, all of a sudden, it's kind of changed Michigan's ceiling a little bit, where we were talking about them maybe before the year as maybe a bubble team. Like I think if Sila continues to play that way, they're into the tournament. Like it bumps them up a little bit more. And we were already expecting these freshmen to be incredibly talented, and they're kind of going above and beyond that.
Yeah, no doubt. There's no doubt about that. And Olivia Olson had 17 in this game as well. Silas Swords did not play in the game at USC the weekend before. They ended up losing that game by 20. They lose this one by 16, but again, they were right there. UCLA went on an 18-5 run late in the fourth quarter to put that one away. But I think you bring up a good point, and it's January 7th. Like there's more questions than answers right now for a lot of these teams. And I think for a couple of them, that's a good thing. And I will explain that. I think Washington and Minnesota, for example, which we're gonna get to the interview here in a second with Gary Hill Jr. Those two teams have more questions than answers, and I think it's a good thing because they're not being forgotten. They're not being left behind. We are asking questions about Washington and Minnesota because I am intrigued by the way they're playing right now. Washington goes and beats Illinois on New Year's Eve on the road, 84-75. And basically for the whole first half without El Ladine. She picks up her second foul 2 minutes into the game, and yet Savia Sellers and Delia Daniels just kind of said, we're fine. We'll take care of it. You get your rest over there. You're going to be ready for the second half. And it was really impressive. So you and I can talk about Washington all we want, but Gary Hill Jr. has got a front row seat to this team. So let's see what he has to say about a really nice start to the season here for Washington. Now on the show is the voice of the Washington women's basketball team, Gary Hill Jr. Gary, thanks so much for joining us. A really nice start to the Big Ten Conference season for Washington, 2-1 on the year. That one loss to the number one team in the country. Outside of that, it's been very solid, just coming off an Illinois sweep, taking down Northwestern and Illinois. Gary, I want to start with the game in Evanston. El Ladine was sensational. Talk a little bit about your point of view watching that performance, a 40-point output for El Ladine.
It was incredible. Her previous career high was 24. She had 26 at the half. So she nabbed her career high by halftime, which is pretty impressive. Also happened to be her birthday. I can't imagine a better way to celebrate your birthday than doing that. But it was just one of those days where she was lights out, and offensively, Washington was really good. You know, Savia Sellers has probably been Washington's most consistent and best player through the course of the season and was very quiet offensively, yet they put 90 points on the board in the ball game. It was incredible. And it was just, you know, I think Elle talked about it after the game. She made like a turnaround in the second quarter and it went in, and she's like, whoa. Like it's all coming together today. And that's exactly what happened. She's a very skilled player, a very skilled scorer, and sometimes probably not as selfish as she should be on the floor because of her talent. But it just all came together that day for her. She was really good.
So you get the 90-71 win over Northwestern. A couple of days later, you go down to Champaign for a matchup with Illinois on New Year's Eve. And I mean, this was a really impressive performance, I thought, because we just talked about El Ladine putting up 40 against Northwestern. She gets in early, foul trouble, no problem. Savia Sellers and Delia Daniels, they were terrific, and a team effort in that win in Champaign for sure.
Yeah, basketball can be a cruel game. You go from 40 points to on the bench 2 minutes in because of two fouls. And, you know, Savia Sellers was great in that game, and she has really been excellent this year for Washington, and really the key difference, I think, offensively for Washington as a team. She really came on last year in her freshman season, moved into the starting lineup in the late stages of the season, but she's really taken that next step forward. She has the ball in her hands all the time. She can really create. She sets the pace. What's really impressive too is kind of when you look at the details of her stat line, it's not only the points per game, you know, it's 15 points per game, but she's super efficient. She's over 50% shooting from the floor as a guard, taking tough shots a lot with the shot clock winding down, that sort of thing. And she's 45% from the 3-point line. She's also top 10 in steals. She's really good defensively. She has been the engine for this team, and she played a great game against Illinois. And it was two games where Washington was, as a team, over 50% from the floor. They shot the three really well against Illinois. They had some punch off the bench, which can be hit or miss, which was a big difference maker in a pretty tough environment. So those are really good back-to-back offensive games for Washington, just team-wise and percentage-wise. Just really well done for the Dogs.
Does it feel like, and you're around this program obviously a lot more than any of us, does it feel like they're trying to play faster this year, have a little bit more of an offensive punch? Because that was 174 points in 2 games in the state of Illinois.
Yes, that is very much on purpose. They're trying to play with their foot on the gas more, and that was a big difference in the Northwestern game. A ton of points off turnovers, and they didn't force a ton, but when they did, they were scoring just about on everyone because they just run the floor, and it's very intentional, and it's worked really well this year. In previous years, they'd really been kind of Princeton style, really slow, taking shots with 5 seconds left on the shot clock, that sort of thing, that sort of pace. But it's been very different this year, and they have the guards to do it. With Ledeen in the backcourt can run the floor, and Sellers and Steins, they have 3 players on the floor most of the time that can handle the ball really well. Even Delia Daniels up front runs the floor really well, so they have the personnel to do it. And it's been a big difference maker for them this year. It's funny, after this weekend where they take 2 games on the road, you kind of look at their season to this point overall, and they had LSU on the ropes in the Bahamas, and they had some bad luck down the stretch, and Sellers fouled out of that game with just a couple minutes to go. They had Utah on the ropes at home and let that one slip away. And even the UCLA game, where they certainly didn't have UCLA on the ropes by any means, but they played well in the game, and they were in touch in that game. They didn't let UCLA run by them, and UCLA is going to run by a ton of teams. Overall, it's been a really solid start to this season for Washington. They've been a much improved team, especially in the offensive end, and they're still playing the kind of defense that they've played. Now, these next 3 games, I think, are going to be a big test with Wisconsin here at home. They'd love to get that one because Michigan State looming on the road coming up, and that's going to be tough.
I think that, and I just called the IU UCLA game this past weekend. I feel like Indiana and Washington played them very similarly, like kept it close enough to still feel like you were in the game, but couldn't quite get over that hump. That's a really good UCLA team. So there's certainly no scoffing at that loss. Feels like the 3-point line becoming a big weapon for this Washington team. 48% in that Illinois trip between the 2 games. Has there been an emphasis for this team to try and attack the 3-point line?
Yeah, it's the difference maker for them offensively. And they have a number of different players. They're at their best when they have different players knocking it down, which I guess you can say that about every single team. But, Sellers has been really consistent from 3, but the daggers have come from maybe people you don't necessarily expect it. And against Illinois, it was Tegan Brown off the bench who knocked in a couple triples. Against Northwestern, it was Coppinger off the bench knocking down a couple triples, who didn't play against Illinois. So it's not only kind of, you expect Sellers, you expect Ledeen as kind of the shouldering things offensively from 3, but when they can get some daggers, Steins in that mix as well from some other sources, they become a pretty difficult team to contend with. Because the thing about this team, they've been so consistent defensively the last few years, which has allowed them to be in every game. What has hurt them is there have been times where they've gone 5, 6, 7 minutes without field goals at a time, yet stayed in the game because of their defense. We haven't seen those long stretches this year, and the 3-ball's been a big part of that.
All right, your first trip to the quote-unquote Midwest Big Ten, you spent a couple of days in the state of Illinois. What was your experience like with the trip, and how did you feel like the team handled the west to east traveling? The Illinois game was pretty early in the day. How did they kind of go about managing that?
So the first striking thing after years of Pac-12 road travel is just how long the trip was. And this one was a little different because the first game was the 28th at Northwestern. So some of the players were flying on Christmas just to get back in time because coach wanted a couple practices. And then so it was like a week essentially with the Northwestern and Illinois game. And, for those that aren't aware of what Pac-12 travel is like, as an example, you'd go to LA, you'd play UCLA on a Friday, day off Saturday, play Sunday afternoon, you'd be back. I mean, there'd be times, like for me, there'd be times I'd be gone for a couple days and that would be it. And this was just really long, especially with the 2 days in between. The travel is going to be something to get used to. They handled it really well because, as you mentioned, the second game in Illinois, that is an early start. I think part of it, they were in Illinois for a long time. So when you have that long of a trip, there was plenty of time to acclimate. So it didn't feel like an early morning game, which Body Clock would be for West Coast. So they handled that really well. It was interesting. It's going to be like this everywhere we go, seeing different places and different buildings. And I thought Illinois was super fun. I thought the crowd was really good. They were really lively. It was a really fun game. So from that aspect, from my perspective, it was really fun to call. And it's really fun to just see other campuses and walk around and see new places. And this whole year is going to be new experiences. The same thing. I've never been to Michigan or Michigan State either. So We have that coming up the week after, and it's going to be what's going to be so. What I'm interested to see how it plays out is kind of how this affects the team over the course of the season. Like, it's one thing to handle a 6-day trip isolated, like Northwestern and Iowa, but you're home for a game, and then you're back out on the road for another week, essentially, against Michigan and Michigan State. And then later on, you're on the road for Ohio State and Penn State, same sort of thing. Like, how is the wear and tear of that during the course of the season going to affect the team? Because that's, it's a week in a hotel. It's, it's all the things that come with travel that can make things difficult.
That's such a big question. Oregon obviously was doing it at the same time you guys were in the state of Illinois. You flip-flopped opponents. USC and UCLA are both over here right now. UCLA in Indiana and USC in Maryland. So it's going to be interesting how this kind of works throughout the season. You mentioned the Michigan trip. I think one of the more exciting games that I have circled for this weekend is Washington at Michigan State. I know you got Wisconsin before then. How do you match up with these two teams in your early prep?
Well, I think I look at Wisconsin, and it's been fun for me to kind of learn about teams. Like, you see teams from a distance, but you don't feel like you really know teams. So it's starting to dive in and get to know Wisconsin really well. And I feel like this is a big game for Washington in that it's at home against a team that if you play well, you can win. And I think that's especially important because you're going to have to get Michigan State and Michigan on the road. I think they're going to have to play great. And so this is one of those games where you look at, where are you going to be in the standings? Where are you going to be at in terms of seeding? And we know it's something I've been talking a lot about. When you look at the conference tournament, man, seeding is going to be everything because first of all, there's a chance you don't make the conference tournament if you finish at the bottom, but then, to win five games in a row, right? Or 4 games in a row. There's a big difference between getting 1 bye or even 2 byes if you can pull that off. So I think seeding is going to be enormous. And that's why I look at a game like Wisconsin coming up as one of those big pivotal games, because I don't think you can go on the road and expect to beat Michigan State or expect to beat Michigan. I think if you can split, that would be great.
Yep.
But a win against Wisconsin, I think, sets that up for Washington. So that's at least how I'm looking at these next 3 games.
Defending home court is going to be really important this season in the Big Ten with all these matchups where you're only playing teams one time. So maybe you only get them at home. You got to try and knock them off at home. And a big one for Washington later today against Wisconsin. Gary, thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you giving us some time. Glad you made it safely through your first trip to Illinois. And we'll look forward to the Hoosiers will be out there in late January. So we'll see you then.
Yeah, it'll be great to see you in person. Can't wait for it.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. Big thank you to Gary for joining us on the show. Really good stuff. I could see I'm watching Dalton in my little screen at the bottom during that. He's scouting. He's studying because Michigan State's got him coming up on Sunday. He's scouting Washington. But he brings up such a good point of the travel. We think about, what's it going to do for this standalone? Like Indiana just played UCLA with what was a 9 a.m. Pacific time tip, and UCLA handled it very well. I thought very unique. UCLA did not show up to the gym until about 11:04 for a noon game. They definitely took their time in the morning and still came out on like an 18-7 run to start the game. So that was not an issue. They handled it very well. But the long-term effects of this, Dalton, nobody knows yet what Washington and Oregon and USC and UCLA are going to look like come February, come March, having done 3 or 4 of these trips where all of a sudden you're totaling 15 to 20 days on the road. That's a lot of travel.
Well, and the long-term effects feels like it was the natural curiosity when this was announced. You kind of sat there and you're like, well, aren't they going to be pretty tired coming back and forth? Like football is one thing where you play once a week, you make one flight out, you make a flight back. It's different in sports like basketball or any of the other sports, baseball, softball, anything that they're going to be competing in the Big Ten. That was kind of the natural curiosity. But what I also found really interesting and hadn't really come to my mind until he mentioned it there, most conferences around the country at mid-major or even like the Pac-12, they had a format of playing like a Friday, Sunday. And that being disrupted, that's something that whenever somebody comes from a different conference, that's usually one of their first negative impressions or opinions on the Big Ten is, What do you mean we play one game this week and we play 3 in like 6 days the next week? Like that's often one of the criticisms that newcomers get to the Big Ten Conference. So it was interesting to me because, of course, and I remember watching so many Pac-12 games last year because the conference was so good, but they had that format. And for that to be disrupted, it's going to mess up the rhythm on top of the flights. I found that to be pretty interesting. And I also don't want this to sneak by people because Gary brought it up there. And I think maybe people have forgotten with the 18 teams, it's a new Big Ten tournament format. Only 15 teams make it into the Big Ten tournament now. So the bottom 3 will not have postseason. They finish their season, turn in the keys, and start heading into the offseason. But that's a difference, too, in this year that I'm not sure if everybody's fully aware of. I think maybe they heard about it, forgot about it. But it was a good point that Gary brought up just to keep it in fresh in our minds.
Well, good transition point. Let's talk about, let's have everybody yell at me here in a second. First, let's do the Big Ten standings. So if it were to end today, Penn State, Rutgers, Northwestern would not make the Big Ten tournament. Obviously, it does not end today. There are still 14 or 15 games left for most teams, but it is an interesting point. The bracket's going to look different this year. Seeding, can you avoid the LA schools as long as possible? That kind of stuff's going to matter. But obviously for the teams kind of 12 through 18, making the tournament is going to be the first thing that's going to matter because then at least you have a shot at it. So 15 teams will make it. That's where we stand right now. You can see there are 4 undefeated teams remaining, the top 4 ranked teams in the Big Ten. Not a huge surprise there. Minnesota at 3-1. They have been a very pleasant surprise. We just talked about Washington. They're sitting at 2-1 with Indiana and Michigan State. So here is where I have teams in my latest power rankings, and where I'm going to eventually make Dalton do this too, so he can get tomatoes thrown at him as well. But I moved Maryland up simply because of the road win at Iowa. I felt like that was worthy of acknowledgement. That's a really hard place to play. You and I have both been there. We know how difficult Carver Hawkeye Arena is to play in. So to go in there and jump out to that 25-point lead, to hold on when the crowd is avalanching against you in the second half and still find a way to win that game, I give Maryland a little bit of a boost. Ohio State and Maryland both with big games tomorrow, so certainly could shuffle things up. Michigan State and Iowa, I think Michigan State is in this weird spot because I think the top 4 are the top 4. I think 6 through like 11 or 12 is a jumbled mess, but I feel like Michigan State has done enough to just kind of be at 5 and just sit there and say, we might not be able to jump Maryland. We lost to them, but we beat Iowa. We're going to hang out in this 5 position. We're just going to chill here. I kept Iowa at 6. I didn't want to penalize them for the loss to Maryland. And then it just becomes, what's the flavor of the day? And the flavor of the day this week to me is Washington and Minnesota. So they jump in. I drop Illinois and Nebraska out. I'd say Illinois and Michigan are Michigan probably 10, Illinois 11, Nebraska 12 kind of situation. Oregon in there as well. They've got back-to-back wins. I keep Indiana there because they lost to the number 1 team in the country. I don't feel like that's worth penalizing them, but take your pitchforks out, Dalton. Where am I wrong? Where do you disagree with me? Because I know when we did this preseason, we had quite a few disagreements. Where would you change this?
Well, and what's funny is preseason, we agreed almost lockstep for a few, and then we had kind of the flavor of the day conversation in the preseason too, and that's where we ended up splitting some hairs. But I think 1 through 5, matter of fact, I think even 1 through 6, you got what I would have. I would go that same order, 1 through 6. I feel like those teams have kind of cemented themselves there. I mean, you talk about Maryland, Ohio State. Right now, I would give the edge to Maryland just because they have 3 top 25 wins, still just waiting on Ohio State to see a challenge. It's going to come, but Maryland's been able to pass those tests here early in the year. You mentioned the 7 through 11 or 7 through 12. This is where it gets interesting to me. Washington and Minnesota, I like there. I'm not necessarily wanting to punish Indiana, but Michigan has tested some of the very best where I would almost consider them into this top 9. And it's fascinating to me that in the middle of all this, we don't really bring up Nebraska. No. And Nebraska is such an interesting team, and it just share the spotlight on them for a moment because we haven't been able to talk about them. They're off to an 11-4 start. But the interesting thing about the Huskers is they've got to do it this season without Natalie Potts.
Yeah.
She tore her ACL 5 games into the season. And since then, Nebraska's been able to manage. I mean, they were tested in that last game against Penn State. They led by 17. Penn State came back over the weekend to tie it up late. Nebraska found a way late. Alexis Markowski, still Alexis Markowski. They've got a talented freshman in Britt Prince, who I'm sure we're going to be talking about some for freshman of the week in future shows at the very least.
Yep.
But Nebraska's kind of hanging around that spot too. I think that's the only team like in that class that we haven't really talked about yet.
Yeah, so here would be my pushback. Nebraska, to me, I need them to prove it against a good team, and I have yet to see that every time. I'm not faulting Nebraska. You lose probably your second best player of the year to a season injury. It's going to take some time to figure out where the roles change, who takes that step up. Callan Hake played great against Penn State. That's a player you need to take a step forward. But they got beat at Georgia Tech. They got beat against Creighton. They got beat against both LA schools, which, again, there's not a whole lot of harm in that. But they also weren't all that competitive in either one of those games. So, to me, can Nebraska, big one tomorrow against Michigan State, can they get one of those kind of wins that is like, oh, okay, this is the Nebraska we saw preseason? Michigan, absolutely. You could put them in this top 9, and I would have no issues with that. Michigan's also a team with, I know you've been competitive with the good teams, but who have you beaten?
Right.
And
no, it's fair.
The bone's pretty bare right now with Michigan. Indiana has at least gone to the Bahamas and beaten Baylor, beaten Columbia, which I think are both 2 potential tournament teams. They beat Stanford, which you can argue whether that's a tournament team or not. But we'll see. Michigan's only Big Ten win right now is Northwestern. They can obviously change that tomorrow against Ohio State. You could probably get me to go Washington 7, Indiana 8, Minnesota 9. I think you could get me there. But Washington and Indiana feel very similar. They feel like they've got some okay wins. Indiana's maybe a little better than Washington's, and then they're both 2-1 in conference with a loss to UCLA by 11 points. Like they're almost the exact same resume. And Minnesota, another team that's playing without their star, Mara Braun. And I think last year has really helped them because I watched that game against Illinois. Dalton, I was extremely impressed with the way that they played coming down the stretch of that game. They were so good. They got Annika Stewart has been one of the probably least talked about but most influential transfers in the Big Ten. Obviously going Big Ten to Big Ten, but she's been really good off the bench for Minnesota. They got contributions from Grocholski, from Battle, from McKinney. They were all over the place, and a really good performance by Minnesota, who deserves, I think, some shine to be in that top 9. Before we run out of time, because I know we're working on a hard stop here, let's talk about what's coming up this week. Some really good games highlighted by, I think, the game of the week in the conference. Number 4 USC at number 8 Maryland. Maryland gets the home court here. USC on the back end of its trip, so there should be jet lag or anything, but a long time away from home. I don't know how much that factors in. It certainly didn't against Rutgers. They blew them out 92-42, but this is one of those games you circled preseason, Dalton. We get to watch on a Wednesday. Both you and I will be broadcasting our respective games during this. I've got it recorded on YouTube TV. We're going to go back and watch it, but what's going to make or break this game? I mean, we know the stars of this game, Juju Watkins, Caitlin Schmeichel. That one-on-one battle is going to be really fun. But what makes or breaks this game?
I think a lot of it, too, is how does the Terps handle Kiki Iriafen in the interior? Because you have good pieces, right? You got Kubek, you've got Poffenbarger who can battle some. Like, you've got interior pieces if you're Maryland, but enough to battle Kiki. That's one I'm really interested in. And honestly, for Maryland, all of those pieces, we talked about the depth and how great it is earlier in this show. They've all got to be firing on all cylinders. I think that's possible. I think it's very doable, but you can't really have a Cheyenne Sellers off night while Schmeichel goes off. Like, it's just going to take everybody to beat Juju Watkins and Kiki and that entire Trojan squad.
It's going to be awesome. I think one of the keys is the 3-point shooting. neither of these teams have been consistently great on the 3-point line, but we've seen it. Maryland obviously went bonkers a couple of times this year, and that's helped them win games. Which team has that shooting night that allow? I think for USC, it's even more important on the road to be able to knock down some shots. They have not been a great, consistent 3-point shooting team this year. And also on the glass, Maryland has been pretty good this year on the glass, but that was a weakness of theirs last year. This is obviously a completely new team, retooled to be better on the glass. But USC is one of the best in the country, especially on the offensive boards. Can Maryland compete with them on the glass? I'm extremely intrigued to see that matchup. Other games this week that are worth talking about. Here's a full schedule. If you can read that visually with us, if you're on the podcast forum, I'll read them off. Tonight, UCLA, the number 1 team in the country, still in the state of Indiana. They're at Purdue. They've had to withstand the snowstorm that we've had here in the state of Indiana this week. Welcome to Indiana, UCLA. Wisconsin's at Washington tonight. Those games are back-to-back on the Big Ten Network, so a fun night of basketball there. Tomorrow is an awesome day. You've got number 9 Ohio State at number 25 Michigan, number 20 Michigan State at Nebraska, and number 4 USC at number 8 Maryland. We're going to learn a little bit about some teams tomorrow. Your Spartans getting a test on the road. What's a key there for Michigan State at Nebraska?
Well, I think for Michigan State, this might be a shocker to the listeners, but Michigan State has never won in Lincoln.
Really?
This will be the 7th time Michigan State's going out to Lincoln. They are 0-6 in Lincoln. They've had close calls. It is a tough place to play, but Michigan State's trying to rewrite history a little bit. And under Robin Fralick, they've been able to do that in some respects. Now, last year, you can make the argument Nebraska was the worst matchup for Michigan State with that personnel and how small it was. Alexis Markowski was just too much to handle. Mackenzie Holmes was kind of the similar cut of cloth at Indiana. Michigan State this year with Grace Van Sluten, they're hoping the size can battle it a little bit. Honestly, the big thing for Michigan State, and this might sound a little ironic, Austin, is the Spartans came out with a top 5 scoring offense to start the season. That's slowed up some. Things have gotten a little congested on the inside. Teams have figured out if they double team, triple team Grace Van Sluten inside that dare somebody to hit some threes. Now, last game against Purdue, Jocelyn Tate hit 3 threes. She only had 6 all of last season. So she's decided to start letting it shoot. And as head coach Robin Fralick says, it's no-brainer threes. Don't think about it, just shoot. And the Spartans are getting a little bit more comfortable with that. But that's the key, I think, is just to create some spacing for the offense. But that other one, Ohio State at Michigan, we talked about earlier. We've been wanting to see Ohio State challenged. It looks like they're going to get one tomorrow night, and that's exciting too.
And Michigan finally gets a team at home. They've played top 10. This will be their 4th top 10 game of the year. They played South Carolina and Vegas, played both LA schools in Los Angeles, and now they finally get one at home. We'll see if that makes a difference for Michigan. I'm gonna issue a challenge here, Dalton, and your Spartans aren't gonna like this, but I'm challenging Alexis Markowski. She's averaging single digits in Big Ten play. She's gone 11, 3, 7, 13. We all know that Alexis Markowski is capable of being one of the best posts in this league. With Natalie Potts out, they got to get more out of Alexis Markowski. I think if she can have a big game, Nebraska might be able to pull an upset there. But she just hasn't been herself here over the last couple of games, and we'll see what she does against Michigan State. Thursday is number 23, a big week for Iowa. They're going to go at Illinois, which is never an easy place to play. And then headlining one of Sunday's games, they're going to be home to Indiana, which over the past few years has brought us some really good finishes there in Iowa City. Sunday's a full slate. I don't know why I didn't change the last date there on the graphic. Apologies. Penn State USC is not on October 20th. That is a January 12th game as well. You got Oregon at Ohio State, Washington at Michigan State, Penn State at USC, and Indiana at Iowa. There's also a couple other games as well. This is not the full slate, but awesome slate of games this week, Dalton. I think if you're a basketball fan, football is winding down. I know there's still playoff games, but it feels like it's starting to get to that time where you turn your TV on and my YouTube TV suggested games are just a bunch of basketball games. There's usually a quad box with some basketball. It's that time of year where we can start talking basketball, full attention on it, channel surfing. It's going to be a great week.
And at this point, every team has just about 14 Big Ten games left, 14 regular season games left. I mean, it's almost like lining up at the track and the starter fires the gun up in the air and we're ready to go with the sprint. This is going to be a lot of fun for the next couple months.
It is the top of the Big Ten, and it's something that baseball's done in the Big Ten, where only 8 of the 13 teams have made the Big Ten tournament, and it adds a little drama outside of just the Big Ten title race. We're going to have that this year with women's basketball. 15 of the 18 will make the tournament, so there's going to be plenty of drama at the top and some drama at the bottom as teams try to make it to Indianapolis at the end of the year. Our first full show with co-host Dalton Shetler. Dalton, thanks so much for joining us. We look forward to having you throughout the Big Ten season. Reminder, you can catch us live at noon every Tuesday here on the Back Home Network YouTube channel. You can watch us after the fact there as well, or listen to us wherever you go on Apple and Spotify podcasts. Thanks so much to Gary Hill Jr. for joining us on the show today. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Renders, saying so long. Of the Dribble Drive. We'll talk to you guys next Tuesday.